guys, welcome to the life of Jesus. And today what we're going to cover is Jesus feeding the 4,000 plus. Now, in keeping in the context, we're assuming that Jesus is still in the Gentile area. Remember, this is coming out of the backdrop of Jesus spending entire inside of the Decapolis area. And the last text we covered, where Jesus heals a deaf man and corrects his speech. There's nothing indicating in the text that Jesus is no longer in this area. So we're assuming that he's still in the Gentile area. And this makes sense considering the fact that Mark emphasizes Jesus' mission that pushes the boundaries of traditional Jewish thinking and perspective and even some cultural aspects. And part of the way that Jesus pushed these boundaries was his outreach to the Gentiles and the things that he did among the Gentiles. And Mark seems to be one who wants to emphasize these specific things. And so this was another way for Mark to do that. And so it seems that what we really have is an account where Jesus feeds thousands of Jews and he also feeds thousands of Gentiles. And so let's get into the text. We're in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 9, and a parallel text will be Matthew 15, 32 through 38. So I'm going to read from Mark. Mark says, "In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he, being Jesus, called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion." Now, the Greek word compassion here that's used, it indicates this deep, this great emotional response that Jesus has is welling up inside of him. And so this emotional response is as a result of the crowd and what he is seeing. So he says, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been, or literally they have continued to be with me now for 3 days. Now, what I find interesting about this is that there is a time stamp here. There's a date here. They've been 3 days, and specifically Jesus mentions 3 days here. And so he says, listen, I'm having compassion on these people, for they have continued to be with me for these 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away, Jesus goes on to say, if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them will have come from far away. And then his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? You get this sense of helplessness. They're wondering, like, of all places to try and do this, this would be the worst place to do this, right? Now, you can't help but think back to the previous time where Jesus fed the 5,000. And this was after a time where the disciples were off on their own doing their little mini mission, if you will. It was a training session, as it were. And they come back and they're celebrating and they're telling Jesus about all the things they were able to do. Jesus had given them power to do lots of things. And they come back and they recognize the situation. And they're the ones who are telling Jesus to send them away. And Jesus says, no, we don't need to send them away. We have everything we need to take care of them right here. You do it. You take care of them. But then they kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, well, we don't know what to do. And so then Jesus proceeds to help them see that the power that they have the power within themselves to do this. They just lacked a sense of trust and faith in themselves to be able to perform these things by the power that Jesus had given them. And one can't help to think back to all the things that Jesus has done in their presence, right? All the amazing things they saw Jesus do. And you can't help but wonder and question, what is going on here? What are they not connecting? What are they missing here, right? And now for us, who we're reading the text one story after another, it's really easy for us to put all sorts of things in place and for us to make all these connections. But you got to remember that the disciples were living with Jesus. These were real moments in time and space. There are lots of things that are going on, lots of things that they're being challenged by, lots of thinking. It's just a massive process that is happening here. And it's much easier for us after the fact to read all of these stories in a row and to begin to make these various connections. Whereas we oftentimes miss those connections as life is happening. Isn't that, I mean, that's the great challenge, right? That's the big challenge for us, and it was the challenge for the disciples. Quite frankly, that's the challenge of us being human and being focused on the moment and what's going on. And we miss all sorts of things as well. And so we need to give the disciples a break here. However, Jesus is going to bring this up a little bit later on, but that's in another text here. So they look to Jesus and they say, wow, in this place, how can, of all places, we're going to do this here. And so Jesus says in verse 5, what I find interesting about this before we go on is Jesus' actions towards the crowd. It demonstrates his own personal compassion, the emotions that are kind of bubbling up inside of him and starting to overflow, and he wants to do something for them. But I think that his compassion is not just being demonstrated to the crowds. I think in this moment, Jesus is also demonstrating his own compassion towards his disciples, his students, right? His patience and forbearance with them. He has some mercy on them. He doesn't look down upon them, and he doesn't oppress them because they don't get it yet. So Jesus says, Jesus asked them, verse 5, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, 7. Again, another interesting number to be very specific here. They were with Jesus for 3 days, and there are 7 loaves that they have. And so Jesus in verse 6 directs the crowd to sit, literally to recline. Recline on the ground. It's like Jesus is saying, "Hey, let's get ready for a feast. Let's do this." And he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And so here the disciples begin to hand the crowd the bread. And in the Greek here, the words demonstrate this continual process of giving. And so it's like Jesus is giving thanks, and he's handing pieces of the bread to the disciples, and they are continuously giving it to the crowds. And this action continues on until people have what they need. In fact, the New American Standard writes it this way: "He gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve to the people." And so there's the picture for us. Jesus is beginning to give thanks, and as he's giving thanks, he's beginning to break the bread, and he continues to break this bread and continues to give it to the disciples until everyone has their fill. And the disciples continue to do this until everyone is served. And then verse 7 says, "And they had a few small fish as well. And having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them." In other words, the same thing that happened with the bread happened with the fish. Okay? "And they ate," verse 8, "and were satisfied." Greek, literally, they were filled. In fact, this is a Greek word that is sometimes translated and means gorging. Like the idea of just, going at it and being completely and utterly and fully satisfied, like you are at the end of a feast. Okay, you've had your fill and then some. That's the picture here. These people were with Jesus for 3 days. They were in desperation. They were hungry. Jesus was concerned about sending them away because if he did, they might not make it. They might faint, okay? It would have been like as if they were fasting for 3 days. Let's imagine that for a moment. And so that's where they are, right? They're in desperation. They're exhausted. They're tired. And they're in need of sustenance, need of life, some rejuvenation. And Jesus says, "I'm going to give it to you. And it's going to come to you with the expression of a feast. You're going to get everything that you need here." And so they eat, and they're satisfied, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And what's interesting about the word here that's translated baskets, and it specifically has to do with a large basket that is flexible. It's reeds woven together, and it's not the same word that is used in Mark 6, where Jesus is feeding the 5,000 among the Jews, where the word that's used there literally deals with a small basket. But the word that's used here is the same basket that was used to let Paul down outside the walls of Damascus and over in Acts chapter 9 verse 25. And so these are baskets that are big enough to fit a person. They're big enough to fit a full-grown man. And so they pick up 7 baskets full. Again, another interesting number to note, right? They started with 7 loaves, and they end up with 7 baskets full of leftover bread and fish. Okay, I find it interesting to note these particular numbers here. And in verse 9, Mark says, and there were about 4,000 people. And Matthew says in Matthew 15:38 that those who ate were 4,000 men besides women and children. And then after they ate, Jesus sent them away. So when I look at this text, obviously there are a lot of things that we can discuss, a lot of things that we can dive into, and well, considering this format here, I'm sure you don't want to listen to me go on and on for hours. Of course, if we were doing this together in an open room with multiple people, the discussions would come out and lots of different things would come out in this text. But here I am left to basically my own thoughts and to share with you some of the things that I see, some of the connections that I see, and I'm sure you probably see even others. That's the beauty of the text here. There's so many layers, so many things to bring out, so many things to discuss. But there are a few interesting things about this account that I think point to, might I say, an underlying or maybe an overreaching message when you step back and look at the bigger picture. First of all, what I see is Jesus is doing to the Gentiles the same things that he was doing to the Jews, okay? He's giving the Gentiles the same attention that he was giving to the Jews. Now, when you consider that concept in light of the context that we have been covering, you go all the way back to when Jesus takes his disciples and they go into the region of Tyre and Sidon, and you have this woman come out of her home and she is begging for Jesus to heal her daughter, and how Jesus uses that as an opportunity to explain to the disciples, to demonstrate to the disciples, to point to the disciples what it looks like to have extraordinary faith. And Jesus was in awe at her faith. But then here's the thing: she's a Gentile, right? She is supposed to be impure, unholy, unclean. Now that's coming out of a context when Jesus, before he actually reaches the land of Tyre and Sidon, he has a confrontation with some Pharisees from Jerusalem. And they're concerned that they challenge Jesus because they're not keeping the traditions of their fathers by eating before they eat, because they had this concept about what causes one to be holy, what causes one to be pure, what causes one to be acceptable in the eyes of God. And Jesus explains to his disciples, as well as explaining to everyone, that what causes you to be unholy and unclean, well, first of all, that's already inside of you. It's in your heart. And when that comes out, it's demonstrated and expressed. It's not what you put in necessarily. It's what's in there that comes out. And so what causes you to be unholy and unclean, it's already inside of you, whether you wash your hands or not. That has nothing to do with it. But now they had a certain status to keep, to maintain. They had a certain standard, right, of what they considered to be, what caused a person to be, should I say, holy and pure. And so Jesus, when he leaves that region, he's using, think about it, his disciples are there. They're being trained, okay? Look, they are about to take, it's just months away before Jesus is going to be put to death, and then he's going to be resurrected. And then the disciples are basically going to take the realm, right? They're going to take charge of this. And so they're watching and observing all these things. And one of the big things that I think Jesus is doing here is expressing to them, okay, what faith looks like. And it's, all these traditions, all these things that they were led to believe about what caused a person to be holy and pure aren't necessarily true. And so you have examples of what that looks like. People who will start to come to Jesus in Gentile areas, right? This woman demonstrates her faith. Jesus continues on into the Decapolis area, and these friends take this man who can't hear, and he has a problem with his speech. And look, if you didn't listen to that message, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that one. Jesus is still in the Gentile area. He's on the mountainside, and people are just bringing people to him to heal. These are Gentiles, and Jesus, man, it's an amazing thing, and points these people to something so much greater. And he's doing the same thing to them that he did to the Jews. And then he's still in this region here, okay? And he's concerned about these people, and he wants to heal these people. He wants to feed these people. He wants to provide things for these people. So this is a huge picture, okay, of the overarching, if you will, boundless mission of Jesus, his love, which will not be held captivity to certain criteria, etc. What an amazing picture this is for the disciples to see, and what an amazing picture for us to see as well. But what I also find interesting about these events is that that it's after Jesus leaves this area. It seems like this is going to be one of the last times Jesus is going to be in this Gentile area, and he's going to go back across, and he's going to go to the west of the Sea of Galilee. And at that point, the journey towards Jerusalem really begins. From one perspective, you might say that, well, the journey began in the very beginning, right? The beginning of his ministry, and I would agree. But now there's going to be some special attention and emphasis, some intentionality to not just the things that Jesus says, but the direction that he is going. You know, it's not long after when Jesus leaves this particular area that he starts having conversations with his disciples. Hey, who do people say that I am? Then he begins to explain to them who he is and what's going to happen to him. And he does this on several occasions. In their journey, they are, make no mistake about it, they are heading towards Jerusalem in more than one way. Mentally, emotionally, and even also, obviously, physically. And so, at this point, Jesus, when he's in this Gentile area, he's doing the same thing to the Gentiles that he was doing to the Jews. That's such symbolic picture here of really what ultimately is going to happen, right? And then once Jesus leaves this area, right, it's almost like Jesus is saying, hey, you're coming with me. I'm not going to forget about you. You're a part of this as well. And the disciples get a little glimpse of that. And then this is when Jesus leaves this area. This is when he begins to head towards Jerusalem. And then eventually, right, leads to his arrest and his death. So clearly, I think that these accounts of what Jesus did in the regions of Tyre and Sidon and in the region of the Decapolis paint a picture of, well, how he really loved the world, right? And while he loved his people, and no doubt he loved his customs and traditions, his heritage, if you will, Jesus was also willing to push the boundaries that, might we say, inhibited his display of love to his own people and to the world. Okay, and I think Jesus, in doing this, truly demonstrated what it looks like to transcend all boundaries. And I don't think it's coincidence that he calls us to do the same. And so something else that I find fascinating in the two accounts that we have of Jesus feeding thousands of Jews and thousands of Gentiles. And I have to be careful with this because I could really go off on this one. I think there's so much symbolism. There's especially when it comes to numbers and understanding how the Jews looked at numbers, just the number 3. There's so much information that I could share, but I'm going to limit it here to just some specific things. But man, there's layers and layers and layers on top of layers and understanding. As a Jew, even if you're reading this text, if you're listening to this text being read by either Matthew or Mark, or you're contemplating this text and what this means, the significance of numbers, those things would jump out at you, and you would see various things. And so it's interesting to note that there are some specific numbers that are given in comparison to the feeding of the 5,000 of the Jews and feeding of the 4,000 plus of the Gentiles here. So first of all, obviously you have the length of time. Now, when Jesus is feeding the 5,000, there's no specific time given. In fact, I think one concludes, it's easily deduced that they were probably there just for that one day at the least, right? I mean, that's kind of generally the picture that we get from that particular text. And so there's nothing specific about the time. They were there. And I think that's symbolic of the fact that, well, Jesus was among his people all the time for most of his life, right? They were always with him. That's the picture, right? But then you come to the Gentiles and you have a specific number that is mentioned here. Specifically mentioned that they were with Jesus for 3 days, right? 3 days. Now, maybe there's no significance here. Maybe this is a stretch. Maybe. Just maybe, right? But I like to think about this, and I want you to consider something. Remember that this is, first of all, this is one story, one event that is a part of a much larger story or a much larger picture. There's a context in which this story is presented to us. This event is presented to us, right? Now, when we look at the event within Matthew and Mark's account, it is after this feeding that Jesus is going to be challenged by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay, they want a sign. And Jesus says that, no, you're not going to get a sign. And he said, except for the sign of Jonah. Now, of course, when you refer to Jonah, we're talking about a man who was in the belly of a great big fish for 3 days. And then he was resurrected, if you will, spit out on dry land. He comes back to life, if you will. And, the story of Jonah is typical of and symbolic of, obviously, Jesus' death, being in the tomb for 3 days, and then his resurrection. And you almost wonder if these people, think about this. These people who had Jesus with them always for, for a long time, saw and witnessed so many things, but because of their faith, they were so hard and calloused, they were not able to conceive what Jesus was doing and to perceive what was happening, and therefore being struck with awe and wonder. They missed all of the signs around them. John 6, Jesus said, all the things that you see me do point to this one thing, that I am from God, and everything that I do is of God, and this is God doing this through me. And so they're asking for a sign, and what more do you want? What more can Jesus give? And when you look at the text, it's almost like as if Jesus is saying, no, you're not going to get a sign. But he did give a sign. He gave them several, but he just gave a sign to the Gentiles, right? And Jesus says, yeah, the sign you're going to get, the only one you're going to get is Jonah, the sign of Jonah. 3 days in the ground, and then resurrected. Obviously, this points to the resurrection, but whenever I consider the text, remember this context of Jesus feeding the 4,000 and plus, and they're there with him for 3 days. Yeah, they got what maybe the Jews wanted. I see a connection there, and I find it very interesting. And because I think about them being with Jesus for 3 days. As I mentioned already, they're hungry, right? They're hungry, they're tired. Jesus has healed some of their sick and their disease. He's been with them for some time. They are people just like those in Galilee who, and others among the Jewish territories that Jesus ministered to. These people are in need of some of the same things. Then after 3 days of being with Jesus, what happens? Well, they receive something that satisfies them, right? They receive rejuvenation. It's like they are brought back to life. There's your sign, symbolic of what's ultimately going to happen, and what's also going to be possible for all people through the resurrection of Jesus. And I also find it interesting that the number 7 shows up in both of these feedings, right? You have, under the Jews, you had 7 loaves. The Gentiles, you had 7 loaves and a few fish, but 7 specifically mentioned. And then when Jesus feeds the 5,000, the Jews, you have 5 loaves and 2 fishes, obviously equaling to number 7. I just find that interesting. I'm not going to go so far as to come up with theories about what those symbolic of, and I'm sure that there are some interesting things that we could talk about that as well. But what's even more interesting to me is the different terms that are used. And this could be subtle, but pay attention to this. There's these different terms that are used to describe the baskets. Yeah, the baskets. And I think that's significant. That are used you remember after everyone's done eating and they're satisfied and their leftovers are picked up and they're filled, the baskets are filled. So when Jesus is feeding the Jews, okay, you have 12 baskets. Now remember, the word basket there is a different word and literally has to do with a small basket. And so 12 small baskets are filled. Now the number 12, what that reminds me of is, the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Quote unquote, God's people, if you will, okay? Which only really represents a very small part of humanity, right? Of the world. But then when you come over to Jesus feeding the Gentiles, you have, when it's all said and done, 7 large baskets. It's a different Greek word, and it has to do with a basket. Remember, it's the same kind of basket that Paul was let down outside the wall of Damascus to escape. And so these are big baskets, okay? And they're filled, all right? So it demonstrates this overabundance. And I think that's indicative of the fact that the basket is big enough, right? The basket is big enough for all people to be included in God's family or in God's people. And this is, I think, one of the biggest messages that we can gain from this. And this is going to be one of the biggest messages that is pushed, is taught, is propagated, that will be received after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, right? And it changes things. It turns things upside down. It's a message that is going to be delivered and propagated by one of the most staunchest Jews during that time, Saul, who becomes the Apostle Paul, who works to fight to remove the barriers that the church wrestled with in the first century. We don't just assume that everything was peachy and everybody got along, because they didn't. There were real barriers that had to be overcome and people had to wrestle and fight with. And it's really no different from today. Still lots of that has to go on. But that's one of the biggest messages that we have. And that's, I think, Jesus' time in the Gentile regions, I think demonstrates to us that there are no boundaries. There are no boundaries. And we were always in this together. And when we realize that, and we realize that and we live from that place, that's when the love of Jesus is expressed, is demonstrated.